Good afternoon, everyone. Today I will be presenting a community analysis of the physically disabled community in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. For this presentation, I intentionally approach disability from an anti-oppressive social work perspective rather than a medical perspective. Too often, disability is viewed primarily as an individual diagnosis or impairment. However, anti-oppressive social work encourages us to examine how systems, institutions, policies, and societal attitudes influence people's experiences and opportunities. The physically disabled community is an important identity community whose experiences are shaped not only by health conditions but also by accessibility, transportation, housing, employment, healthcare systems, recreation, and public policy. My goal is to examine both the strengths and structural barriers that exist within this community while considering the implications for social work practice. Before discussing Philadelphia specifically, it's important to define what I mean by community. Communities are often thought of as neighborhoods, but social work recognizes that communities can also be based on shared identities and common experiences. The physically disabled community includes individuals with a wide variety of mobility related disabilities. While community members live across Philadelphia, they are connected through disability organizations, healthcare systems, advocacy groups, adaptive recreation programs, peer networks, and shared experiences navigating accessibility. Viewing disability as a community rather than simply a diagnosis shifts our focus away from individual deficits and toward understanding the social, environmental, and structural factors that influence participation and quality of life. This community analysis is grounded in anti-oppressive social work practice. Anti-oppressive social work practice recognizes that many of the challenges experienced by marginalized communities result from unequal power structures rather than individual deficits. Within disability, this means recognizing that inaccessible transportation, discriminatory policies, housing shortages, and societal attitudes often create greater barriers than a person's diagnosis itself. This framework also aligns closely with the social model of disability. Unlike the medical model, which focuses primarily on impairment, the social model argues that disability is produced when environments fail to accommodate human diversity. For example, someone who uses a wheelchair is not limited because they use a wheelchair. They become limited when buildings lack ramps, sidewalks are inaccessible, or employers fail to provide reasonable accommodations. This perspective encourages social workers to advocate for changes within communities rather than expecting individuals to adapt to inaccessible systems. Historically, disability was understood almost exclusively through the medical model. The primary focus was on treatment, rehabilitation, and institutionalization rather than community participation. Beginning in the 70s, disability advocates challenged this perspective by arguing that accessibility and equal participation are civil rights issues. Landmark legislation such as the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act established important legal protections against discrimination. The Olmsted Supreme Court decision further reinforced the right of individuals with disabilities to receive services within the community rather than in segregated institutional settings whenever appropriate. Today, the disability justice movement continues to expand disability advocacy by recognizing the intersections of disability with race, gender, socioeconomic status, sexuality, and other identities. This evolution reflects a broader understanding that communities share responsibility for creating environments where all individuals can fully participate. Philadelphia has played an important role in advancing disability rights and community inclusion. Following passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, local organizations worked to improve accessibility throughout the city. The independent living movement emphasized that individuals with disabilities should have the opportunity to live independently within their communities rather than institutional settings. This philosophy continues to influence disability services today. Philadelphia is also home to nationally recognized rehab programs that provide specialized care following spinal cord injuries, strokes, TBIs, amputations, and progressive neurological conditions. These organizations have helped shift disability care toward community participation and long term independence. Understanding the community requires looking beyond disability itself and considering the broader social detriments of health. Philadelphia has one of the highest poverty rates among U.S. cities. Individuals with physical disabilities are disproportionately affected by unemployment, limited income, inaccessible housing, and transportation challenges. Although Philadelphia offers excellent healthcare resources, access is not equally distributed across neighborhoods. Transportation, insurance limitations, provider shortages, and financial barriers can delay care or reduce participation in community life. These social and environmental factors often have a greater impact on quality of life than an individual's medical diagnosis. One of Philadelphia's greatest strengths is the number of community resources available for individuals with physical disabilities. Philadelphia is home to nationally recognized rehab hospitals, including McGee and Moss, both of which provide comprehensive rehab services following spinal cord injuries, strokes, TBIs, amputations, and neuro disorders. Community organizations such as Liberty Resources and Inglis focus on independent living, advocacy, employment supports, housing assistance, and peer mentoring. Transportation also represents a significant community asset. SEPTA has expanded accessibility through elevators, low floor buses, and paratransit services. It's important to note, though, SEPTA still sucks, and most of those services are typically unavailable or quote unquote out of service. While these services improve mobility for many residents, accessibility remains inconsistent across neighborhoods and transit stations. This is a map that I made of Philly and the different assets that the disability community has access to. So, one of Philadelphia's greatest strengths is the number of community resources available for individuals with physical disabilities and even emotional and intellectual disabilities, which is a whole other, can of worms. Philadelphia is home, like I said, to a lot of amazing rehab hospitals. We have Inglis House. What else do we have? We have Mainline Center for Independent Living. We have quite a few accessible entry into the SEPTA station, which honestly, it should be at every station. I was recently in Europe, and as someone who uses a wheelchair, as an ambulatory wheelchair user, I was shocked to find out that I didn't have to skip a station to find the accessible ramp or the elevator. Like every single station, whether it was a train or a trolley or subway, they were all basically accessible. And this was particularly in the Netherlands, and it was absolutely amazing. It was such a treat. And at the same time, I don't think it should be a treat. It should just be there. Um, yeah. While these services improve mobility for many residents, I kind of spoke to this already. Accessibility remains inconsistent across neighborhoods and train stations um, all over the city. I think some of the statistics are important to talk about. We have a population of 1.57 million people in Philadelphia. But here's the biggest catcher: 15 to 17% of residents report a disability, and mobility disabilities are among the most common. 24% live below the federal poverty level, and many residents rely on Medicaid, Medicare, or dual eligibility. Disability community is diverse across age, race, ethnicities, and neighborhoods. And this is the my virtual windshield survey. So clearly, I could have, surveyed the entire county, but I chose to hone in on the places that I've lived, which are Center City, UC, West Philly, and the Museum District. Out of all of them, the strengths were ADA curb ramps throughout the business districts. Most had accessible public buildings, especially in the Museum District, in University City, in Center City, in West Philadelphia. It was a toss up. There's a ton of hospitals clustered near University City, tons of pharmacies. I've already spoken a little bit to the public transportation and the pros and cons to that. There are some green spaces, definitely as you go into like West Philadelphia towards and also towards the Museum District, you're gonna find more green spaces and a little bit in Center City, in Rittenhouse. There are wheelchair accessible sidewalks and newer developments. Still a challenge though. However, the most observed challenges that I thought of and studied were older sidewalks with uneven pavement. This is awful in Old City. It is terrible. I believe there is a recent gun violence survivor. Her name is Amanda Persian, I think. It starts with a P. She's also a professor in OT, and she was an occupational therapist prior to her injury, and she's doing a lot of advocacy in Old City to improve the accessibility and repair the sidewalks. However, a lot of the people, a lot of the people who have lived there are wealthy and don't really care about the disabled, and they're like, don't tear up the 250-year-old bricks on the sidewalk. Like that is history, and it's also 2026, and we need more accessible sidewalks. Period. Also, this goes with the inconsistent curb ramp maintenance. People underestimate that as wheelchair users, we need the curb cut. We need curb cuts, period, but we need it to be functional because how else are we going to get off of the sidewalk? All I can think about is a good telltale like visual would be Old City. However, this is widespread across Philadelphia, obviously. Broken sidewalks goes with that. Limited accessible parking. Holy crap, this is a huge one. And whether it's in public places, whether you're shopping at Target or you're going on Walnut Street or you're even trying to park at the hospital, like I have no idea. It's so frustrating. Um, However, this is even truer, I think, with off-street parking. So, say you have you have an apartment in West Philadelphia, and you have a designated handicap spot that the city allowed you to have. The PPA like leaves you alone, like this is your designated spot for your unit, and people just park there. So like that's also an issue. There's a ton of construction over so many different neighborhoods in the city, and that's also a huge factor. And older businesses with difficult entrances. We could get into a whole other conversation about that. Super frustrating. So, as we think of the anti oppressive analysis, um, rather than asking how disabled individuals can adapt to inaccessible systems, anti oppressive practice encourages us to ask how communities can become more inclusive. Social workers play an important role in advocacy, policy development, coalition building, and community organizing. This includes supporting accessible housing initiatives, improving transportation systems, promoting disability representation in decision making, and addressing ableism within healthcare, education, and employment. Ultimately, accessibility benefits everyone. Features such as curb cuts, elevators, automatic doors, captioning, and universal design improve participation not only for disabled individuals but also for older adults, parents with strollers, travelers, and many others. Community inclusion should therefore be viewed as a collective responsibility rather than an individual accommodation. I'm going to repeat that. Community inclusion should therefore be viewed as a collective responsibility rather than an individual accommodation. Huge. And at the end of the day, accessibility is a human rights issue, not simply a disability issue. I think this was a duplicate, so I'll delete that. Anyways, Implications for social work practice. Social workers have responsibilities that extend beyond providing individual services. Anti oppressive practice calls us to examine and challenges the systems that create inequities. At the micro level, social workers support individuals by promoting self determination, advocating for accommodations, and connecting clients with community resources. At the meso level, social workers strengthen relationships between organizations, healthcare providers, advocacy groups, and community partners to improve coordination of care and increase opportunities for participation. At the macro level, social workers advocate for legislation, funding universal design, disability inclusive policies, and equitable access to housing, employment, education, transportation, and healthcare. Ultimately, disability advocacy is not a specialized area of practice. It is an essential component of social justice and an ethical social work practice. So, what recommendations do I have? Based on the community analysis, several recommendations emerged. First, increasing affordable, accessible housing should remain a priority. Accessible housing shortages limit independence and community participation for many individuals with physical disabilities. Transportation also remains critical. Although Philadelphia has made progress, inconsistent accessibility across transit systems continues to create barriers. Employment initiatives should focus not only on hiring individuals with disabilities, but also on ensuring workplaces remain accessible and inclusive. Healthcare accessibility extends beyond physical access. Providers should receive training that addresses disability bias and communication and person centered care. Finally, disabled individuals should be actively included in community planning, advisory boards, and leadership positions. Decisions affecting disability communities or disabled communities should always include disabled voices. And positionality. This is me. I am a disabled human, and this is an ongoing challenge that I still face day in and day out. However, I am extremely fortunate and in a better position than 99% of Philadelphians because of my schooling, my what's the word that I'm looking for? My privilege, and I will never stop talking about this. It is a huge, huge thing for me. In conclusion, disability should not be understood solely as an individual characteristic. Instead, it represents a community identity shaped by relationships, policies, institutions, and environments. Philadelphia possesses remarkable strengths through its healthcare systems, advocacy organizations, adaptive rec programs, transportation services, and community partnerships. However, structural barriers remain. Anti oppressive social work reminds us that our responsibility extends beyond helping individuals navigate systems. We must also work to transform those systems, and ultimately, equitable communities benefit everyone. Accessibility is not a privilege or an accommodation for a select few. It is a fundamental component of social justice and community well being. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.